Hi, I'm Abadesi Osunsade, founder and CEO of Hustle Crew, a careers community on a mission to make tech more inclusive. Since 2016, we've been using training just like this to educate teams about why they're not diverse by default. Why is it that you can walk into the underground stations here in London and see a cross-section of society, but once you walk into a co-working space like WeWork, it tends to reflect the dominant groups, men who are white, wealthy, cisgendered, heterosexual. You know the deal. Well, we want to make sure that you understand why teams aren't as diverse as the society that they're built in, so that you can take a role in actually reducing the blockers to greater diversity, representation, and belonging in your team. So, if you're ready, I'll tell you what this course is going to cover. We're going to talk about some of the most common types of biases in the workplace so that you can start to recognize them when they're playing out in your team. We're going to take you through some real-life scenarios that have been volunteered from our community so that they'll help you really understand how these biases play out, but also what you can do to be an ally and challenge them. Don't worry about taking too many notes because we've got a cheat sheet and a worksheet ready to go just for you. Plus, a bunch of other articles on our Members Hub so you can continue your learning journey after the workshop. With that in mind, let's jump into it. What do you know about the science behind biases? But also, what do you know about the science behind systemic injustice and systemic oppression? Well, there are academics that spend decades, if not lifetimes, studying all of this, but I'm going to give you the best bits now to help you on your learning journey as you try to be a better ally and an inclusion champion. Let's start with the science behind bias. Why is it that our brains make shortcuts? Now, if you had to think about how many decisions you've had to make just today alone, how many would that be? Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands? Well, according to an article by Inc.com, the average adult makes millions of micro decisions before they even start their working day. Just think about that. Which foot should I use to get out of bed first? My left or my right? Should I brush my teeth or have a glass of water? Will I put my toothpaste on before or after I wet my toothbrush? Again, there's so many different types of decisions that we're making at any one time that most of them, frankly, are unconscious. We're not really giving them much attention. And we can understand why that is. Back in the day, millions of years ago, our ancestors probably had to make quick decisions to survive, to stay alive, to run away from saber-toothed tigers, who knows? But in this day and age, these mental shortcuts, also known as heuristics, can actually become blockers to wider company goals, like increasing representation of members of the LGBT+ community or disabled people in our global team. If we don't do anything to identify these unconscious biases and unpack the reason why they continue to exist in our society, we are at risk of perpetuating the status quo instead of challenging it. So, we have research from things like Harvard University's implicit bias study that show us that we continue to make outdated decisions about people based on their identity. For example, traditional gender roles are still alive and well. We tend to assume that women are better in the home as mothers, as homemakers, and that men are better in business. Yes, even now in the 21st century. So it's important for us to recognize the fact that research exists to show us that our biases are alive and well. Another great source of research is McKinsey's Women in the Workplace study. They study organizations and particularly the impact of bias against women. And what we see is that women continue to face a gap when it comes to not just pay, but also promotions by virtue of the fact that we hold on to traditional gender roles and we make assumptions about what men will be best at in the workplace and what women maybe won't be best at in the workplace too. So it's really important that we lean into this data and recognize the fact that we're not perfect and there's still so much that we need to do to improve the workplace for all of us. So we've talked a bit about the science behind biases, the reasons why our brains have been conditioned to make super quick shortcuts. And we've also talked about the science behind how these super quick shortcuts unfortunately become blockers to our inclusion goals at work, specifically by perpetuating the status quo. We talked about the Harvard implicit biases showing us that we still subscribe to traditional and outdated gender roles about men and women in the home and the workplace. And McKinsey's Women in the Workplace study also showed us that these traditional gender roles that we have embedded into our minds impact us materially in the workplace through promotions, pay rises, even the salary offers we give to women. And of course, there are so many layers when it comes to this. It's not just about gender, it's about all of the elements of our identity, our sexuality, our socioeconomic class, our race, our disability status. The list goes on. Our nationality, whether or not we have dependents at home, whether or not we had generational wealth growing up. So once you start unpacking it, you can tell there are a lot of different things with which we can hold our biases. And that's why it's so important for us to not just do the work of recognizing our biases, but also do the work of recognizing who are the dominant groups within our society, who runs government, who runs our company, who runs our industry, and what privileges do those people hold? Conversely, what privileges do people who don't represent the dominant groups lack? And using myself as an example, what are the privileges I have in relation to my similarities to the dominant groups? But also, what are the privileges I lack due to the differences I have with these dominant groups? It's so important to explore both our privileges and biases in parallel in order to accelerate progress on our diversity and inclusion goals at work. There are a lot of articles out there that are going to tell you things like unconscious bias training doesn't work, training about diversity and inclusion doesn't work. And you know what? I don't disagree with some of those things, because truly, one-off actions don't change anything. We are living in a world that, due to the history of civilization, is steeped in injustice and unfairness. So if you as an individual or as a wider team or as a company want to do something about that to help you reach your goals, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot more than a one-off training or one-off action to really create lasting change. You are going to need to build habits, because those habits will add up over time to help you make progress on your goals. And that's why this training is so important. One of the things that I want to do in this section is actually teach you some of the most common types of bias that show up in the workplace so that you can create a habit of challenging them when you see them. You can not just have to engage in a conflict, but actually use that as an educational moment to say, hey, I think something is happening here, and it's really important that we actually unpack it and take it for what it is so that we can learn and so that we can grow and so that we can make progress on our goals. So, as I said to you, research from Harvard's implicit bias study and also McKinsey's Women in the Workplace study show us some really interesting things. They show us that, for example, performance bias is prevalent in the workplace. Performance bias is based on, again, outdated traditional gender roles about our ability to perform at work. We assume that because we always see men as CEOs, listing their companies on the stock market, on the cover of Fortune magazine, that men make better CEOs. And because every time we turn on the TV and watch a movie about a family or a new sitcom about, a family, we see the mother in that archetypal matriarchal role, managing the household, doing the school run, cooking dinner, we assume that women perform better as parents. Performance bias is alive and well, and we have to do everything that we can to challenge it. Related to performance bias is attribution bias. Again, research from McKinsey and leanin.org show us that due to outdated gender roles, we tend to attribute success in teams and collaborative environments predominantly to men. And conversely, we tend to attribute failure for projects predominantly to women. A really great example of how attribution bias plays out in the media is looking at all of the female founder takedown cover stories that were so popular throughout 2020, 2021, and then compare that with how some male CEOs, also in the tech industry, are hero worshipped. Elon Musk, for example. So, these are two of some of the most common types of workplace bias, but the list goes on. Parental bias is another type of bias that impacts parents. We assume once they come back to work, they're not as focused on their career as they were before they had a child. We assume this even though we have evidence to prove the contrary. These are just 3 types of really common workplace bias, but I encourage you to continue reading on our Members Hub to learn more and keep sparking challenging, uncomfortable, but important conversations about how these show up and what we can do to mitigate their impact on our goals. Let's talk about 2 more types of bias before you put yourself in the driver's seat and take action by completing the worksheet. Affinity bias is a bit like that saying, birds of a feather stick together. Research shows us that hiring managers are more likely to spend more time with candidates who remind them of themselves. And similarly, in the workplace, mentors like to mentor people who remind them of themselves. Now, it's a natural thing. I'm sure we're all guilty of doing it. However, what happens when we never challenge affinity bias? Currently, we have a workplace that's dominated by a certain type of person. There's a homogeneity of maleness, of whiteness, of able-bodiedness, cisgenderedness, etc. If we do nothing to talk about affinity bias or challenge affinity bias, then nothing will change. We won't close our gender pay gap, and we certainly won't hit our representation goals. Another type of bias, made most popular by Sheryl Sandberg, former CEO of Meta, is likability bias. She noted that as she became more senior in her tech career, she found herself facing criticisms that her male peers did not face, particularly when she asserted herself in her role. Now, research has shown us that this is known as likability bias. Due to outdated gender roles, where we tend to see women in a caring and nurturing role, and more likely see men in a dominant, bossy role, we react negatively towards women that embody bossy behavior. In fact, we go as far as to label them with words we would not use with male counterparts, like intimidating, bossy, aggressive. Ladies, ringing any bells? So, with all of these types of bias in mind, performance bias, attribution bias, likability bias, and affinity bias, let's jump into the tasks. It's really important that you get comfortable recognizing types of bias when they're playing out in the workplace. This is because you might very well be on the receiving end of a type of bias when you're trying to assert yourself in your role, when you're trying to negotiate for a compensation change or for a promotion. Or conversely, you could be guilty of not recognizing your bias when making really important decisions, like who you should hire into the new role in your team, or who you should give a pay rise or promotion to. There are so many decisions we all have to make every day, and it's really important that we create that habit of checking our bias as often as we check our spelling, because only then will we really create lasting change to challenge the status quo and make progress on our goals, whether that's increasing representation of underrepresented groups in our employee base, or reaching a wider, more diverse audience to help us increase our revenue and profit over time. So, I'm going to use myself as an example and talk you through ways that I have been on the receiving end of types of biases, because that's going to set you up to complete the worksheet. I recall when I first became a manager. I was 24 years old, working at a fast-growing startup known as Groupon. This was a while before the eventual IPO of the organization. So, being a manager, it was really important for me to do everything that I could to set my team up for success. We were in a sort of account management role, so we were on the phones all the time dealing with different merchants that were running Groupon deals. Now, when it came to our first ever 360-degree manager review, I was invited to get feedback from my team about how I was performing as a manager. It was all collected anonymously, and my department head invited me to a meeting to talk me through some of the feedback that I got. Now, unlike my male peers on the team, I got a lot of feedback that I was quite intimidating and aggressive. Now, he encouraged me to take my team out for lunch and understand what I could do to be less intimidating and aggressive. So, of course, I did that. I took my team out and I was very honest. Hey, I received this feedback that I come across as intimidating and aggressive, and it's really important for me that you can trust me. You can come to me with your issues. So please let me know what I can do to be less intimidating and aggressive. There was silence across the team. Finally, one of the guys on my team spoke up and said, "You know what? I used to think of you as intimidating and aggressive, but now I just think of you as one of the guys, and that makes your behavior okay." He turned to the rest of the group, and they all nodded in agreement. I suddenly realized, without quite having the language for it, that I was experiencing a type of bias, because they had just admitted that if the same behavior, words, and actions came from a male leader, they would be totally fine with it. And in fact, thinking of me as a male leader made them okay with it. Now that I've done research on understanding bias, started the Hustle Crew company, I can recognize that as a type of likability bias. But I couldn't at the time. Now, if I could go back there, I would use that as an opportunity to start that conversation and say, hey, what do you think about the fact that if this behavior came from a guy, you wouldn't have an issue with it, but seeing it come from a woman makes you give that woman negative feedback? Like, have you thought about some of the consequences of behaving in that way on her career development? But also, have you thought about how that maybe doesn't align with our values to challenge bias and be equitable and be inclusive and fair? If I knew then what I knew now, that could have been a really powerful learning opportunity for them and for my team, and a way for me to then deliver that feedback all the way back up to the department head and say, hey, can we challenge some of this constructive feedback that I've received? Because it doesn't look like there's any real evidence for it. Okay, let me use myself as an example again. Think about a time where you have collaborated on a project or been brought into an ideation session. I can think of so many. One particular one comes to mind when I had just started in my career in journalism. I was at an ideation session, coming up with different ideas of things that we could do, articles that we could write about, when it suddenly dawned on me that an article suggestion that I had made a few minutes ago that was ignored and shut down was being volunteered again by someone else. Now, what was interesting in this occasion was that the idea was tabled and praised, and a lot of people said, wow, that's absolutely awesome, let's pursue it. Now again, at that time, I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. I didn't even have the courage to speak up and say, hey, I mentioned that. Nor did I have any allies in the room that could have spoken up for me and said, hey, do you know what? Abadesi actually made that suggestion a few minutes ago, and that was really great. So these are, again, just some real life examples from my own career that perhaps you will find some parallels with, to bring to light exactly how bias shows up. Now, in the second example, it's attribution bias that was at play, because while I did have that idea, and perhaps the person didn't hear me, he might not have heard me, that's fine. What happened next was that no one attributed that idea to me. They attributed it to the person who simply echoed it, repeated it, and no one stood up to kind of say, hey, this person came up with that idea first, and I think we should give them credit. Okay. Hopefully, these examples have brought things to light for you, have maybe connected the dots a bit between the types of bias that have been researched and the actual bias as it plays out in the workplace. I hope that it's also got your neurons firing, making you reflect on times where you've witnessed bias in the workplace. Maybe something that's happened recently, or maybe something you almost feel bad, guilty, or ashamed of now. Hey, no judgment, it's a journey, we're all learning. With all of these things in mind, I invite you to take a couple of minutes now to work on your worksheet, complete the answers, and I'll see you after that. Earlier in the course, I talked to you about the importance of studying types of bias as well as your privilege in parallel in order to accelerate progress on your inclusion goals and be a better ally for all the different lived experiences within your team. So before we wrap up this training, it's really important that I give some time to help you understand the role that privilege, history, and systemic injustice play in perpetuating these blockers to progress, in perpetuating the existing biases that we know about, we've researched about, we talk about, but somehow still aren't doing enough about. So one of the things I would like to focus on in particular here is the role of the media in maintaining the status quo. Now, don't get me wrong, if you spend time on the right social media channels and the right profiles, the right blogs, you're going to see plenty of content that challenges the status quo and educates you on all the different ways that we perpetuate inequity and all the different roles that institutions like formal education, the healthcare system, the police play in perpetuating prejudice, perpetuating bias, and effectively affirming the agenda of dominant groups. Okay, so I'm not going to bog you down with those details. Instead, what I want to talk about is the role that mass media in particular plays in perpetuating those outdated traditional gender roles that I talked about we see reflected in the Harvard Implicit Bias Study and also in the McKinsey Women in the Workplace Study. Now, these harmful narratives about what women are best at or what women should be are not just limited to women as an identity group. We also see harmful, limiting, even damaging narratives about other types of people, whether that's Black people, people with disabilities, people from the LGBT plus community, etc. Now, before I jump into some specific examples, it would be remiss of me to not call out one of the most leading academics that research the role of mass media in perpetuating inequality, in fact, perpetuating hate. We lost her recently, but her name is Bell Hooks, and you haven't heard about her or read any of her stuff, I highly recommend that you do. Bell Hooks believed that pop culture is exactly where we are educated. When we grow up watching music videos that show, gyrating booties of sexy young women and, gangster rappers flashing cash and boasting about drug dealing, we create this idea, this story, that is what Black culture is all about. And similarly, when we grow up watching movies set in the 1950s, where dad puts on his suit, gets his briefcase, jumps into his Cadillac and drives to the office, while mom stays at home baking cookies and hoovering the apartment, we again perpetuate this idea that men belong in the office and women belong at home. Now I know what you're thinking, gosh, do we still really believe those things? Well, take a look at how the media talks about women who don't subscribe to traditional gender roles. How does the media favor women who choose to be child-free? Do we see those women represented in the stories, in the shows, in the movies that we watch? How does the media respond to women who choose to be assertive? Think of the few women running countries in the world or running businesses. Are they treated the same way that their male counterparts are? For example, are we assessing their strategy or are we assessing their outfit choices? Think about it. Again, look at how the media treats violence and particularly how the violence is described depending on who is the perpetrator of violence. Think about how crimes that are committed by affluent white male men are described in the media versus crimes committed by young Muslim men or young Black men. Check if the language is the same. More likely, you will see young Black men described as gang-related or gangsters, even if there's yet to be evidence to prove that. And you'll see the reluctance to describe crimes committed by affluent white men as crimes. Will always find an excuse to justify their behavior. So these are just some of the common ways in which media, the stories that we tell, the stories that we consume, play a very powerful role in maintaining our biases. It's going to be very difficult for us to challenge traditional gender roles or outdated racial stereotypes and cultural stereotypes if every time we go to the TV for entertainment or turn on the news to educate ourselves, these same outdated and harmful stories are reinforced. Don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of great improvements in the media. We see more representation. Films like Black Panther put Black culture on the map in a completely different way. It wasn't about gangsters. It wasn't about a poor family growing up in the projects. It was about Black excellence, and it was beautiful. And while things are certainly getting better on the representation front, I can think of, blockbusters like Black Panther that showed a completely different narrative of Black characters for the first time. Not about gangsters, not about rappers, not about people living in the projects, not about slaves, but a completely different take on Black culture and Black excellence. Or I can think of Crazy Rich Asians. Again, not about people running a Chinese restaurant as immigrants in the US, or, not about the olden times of amazing Asian civilizations, rather modern Asians right now living their best lives. But these examples are still too few and too far between. Why don't you do a little audit of your current media consumption? What books are you reading? What podcasts are you listening to? Which news articles are you reading? What albums are you listening to? What was the last movie that you saw? And what was the representation of the creators? Did they mirror your lived experience? Or was the diversity there? Were you taking that initiative to step out of your lived experience and see something through another gaze? For many of us, that's still something we're really not doing. And frankly, it's not like there's a lot of content out there to help us do it. So until we continue to see more representation, more different stories about underrepresented people, a departure from traditional gender roles, outdated stereotypes, seeing Black people play something that's not a gangster, seeing people in a wheelchair just having a sex life or a normal life, not focusing specifically on them having a disability, then we will really know that we are starting to see change. And I'm not going to hold my breath until then, but I encourage you to keep a lookout for content that actually challenges the status quo and give that more attention and spread that in your teams. Keep that curiosity for other lived experiences alive, and also be more mindful to the role that media plays in perpetuating biases. Don't take headlines at face value. Instead, interrogate them. Look at how different reporters report on a story, particularly when the reporters have a different lived experience, a different socioeconomic class, and try and find your truth between those two different narratives. Apply a lens of critical analysis to everything you do. Just as you need to check your bias as often as you check your spelling to build healthy habits to create lasting change, you also need to interrogate the content that you consume, because it could be challenging your journey in the opposite direction. It could be sending you back. So you need to make sure that you're being really vigilant about the media that you consume, so that it also helps you expand your mindsets, expand your comfort zone, and keep doing that great work of championing inclusion. Hurrah! You have reached the end of this e-learning workshop. Great job. In the next few minutes, I'm going to recap what we covered and remind you what you get out of it and how you can keep this learning journey moving forward. Because as we said, one-off actions will not change the world. One little training is not going to create lasting change. Rather, we can just help you build those habits to accelerate progress on your inclusion goals. So we started with a little intro to me and the work that Hustle Crew has been doing to make teams more inclusive by teaching tools and frameworks to reduce blockers to greater diversity and representation. Then I brought you a bit of the science behind these mental shortcuts that our brains make, a bit of the science behind, bias and why it's still so prevalent and what we can do to recognize it and challenge it. I mentioned some amazing data sets that I encourage you to go out and explore further, Harvard's implicit bias study, as well as McKinsey's Women in the Workplace reports, which are published annually. Leaning into those powerful data sets and that research, I talked about some of the most common types of bias that show up in the workplace. I also gave you some examples from my own career. We talked about affinity bias and how people just prefer people who look like them. I'm not immune to that. We also talked about performance bias, which is based on traditional gender roles, identity roles, and how that plays out in the workplace. For example, real life impact of performance bias in compensation and the gender pay gap. We also talked about attribution bias, which is closely linked to performance bias. This idea that, again, because we're so used to seeing men asserting themselves in the workplace and, women being more suited to home life, we tend to attribute workplace success to men, even in a mixed team, and conversely, attribute failure to women in a mixed team. That's just one of the ways it shows up. Then we talked a bit about likability bias, one that I know all too well, sadly. I talked about the way that, again, due to outdated gender roles, when women take on that assertive workplace leader role, we can react quite negatively to that. But we can actually end up rewarding men for the same behavior. That's actually a bit of a, challenging, sticky situation, because if we're also too nice, then we're seen as incompetent, which sucks. After we talked about the most common types of biases, I also shared some stories from my career journey. The purpose behind me sharing these stories was to show you how bias played out in real life, but also to invite you to think about how this learning could be put into action. Because if I had known then what I know now, all of the times I was on the receiving end of a type of bias could have been a really amazing opportunity to spark up a conversation and challenge me and my team to learn together about the blockers to our goals. Goals like reducing our gender pay gap and, promoting more women into senior roles. Goals which I'm sure you and your teams have too. So hopefully those were great ways for you to understand how you can put this learning into action, stretch your comfort zone, normalize having difficult conversations about our lived experiences, our identities, and how the way we move through the workplace is shaped and impacted by these things. And then finally, we spend a lot of time talking about why. Like, why does this stuff still happen in the 21st century? And for the purpose of this workshop, I focused on the role of the media, because mainstream mass media plays a very powerful role in shaping our perception. Some might argue perception is reality. So it's really important for us to understand why we continue to have outdated traditional gender roles embedded into our minds, and why we continue to have really stereotypical ideas of certain identities embedded into our minds. For example, close your eyes and picture a nurse. What gender were they? What race were they? Close your eyes and picture a gang member. What race were they? What gender were they? Most likely, the image you saw is based on a media representation, but maybe not based on the actual cold, hard facts or evidence of what those people really are. So hopefully this has inspired you to continue to spark these conversations about the role of the media, not just in your work life, but in your personal life too, and hopefully encourage you to even take some time to think about the media that you consume, to ensure that you are consuming media that helps you accelerate your learning journey to be a better ally and to be an inclusion champion, not consuming content that's going to set you back. So, with all of that in mind, I wanted to remind you that you can submit your worksheet to be approved for certification on this course. Yes, that's right, you will get a certificate. You can print it, put it on your desk, do what you like. You can, of course, also add a Hustle Crew badge to your LinkedIn profile. I know you want to do that. I've got to, yeah. So, well done you. Hopefully other people on your team have been able to complete this course as well, in which case you can continue these conversations, continue learning together. You have access to a bunch of incredible articles all across this e-learning hub, articles that have suggestions for activities in your next one-to-ones, your next team meetings, your next all hands. There's so much more amazing work that you can do. I really hope that you do it, and we can't wait to hear from you. So if you have ideas on how this session could be improved, ideas for future courses, or you just want to tell us how much you enjoyed this, hopefully, or maybe how much you didn't, just drop us a line, hello@hustlecrew.co. Can't wait to hear from you.